Tantor Audio presents The Sex Myth, The Gap Between Our Fantasies and Reality by Rachel Hills. Narrated by Callie Beaulieu. The most toxic formulas in our cultures are not passed down in political practice. They're passed down in mundane narratives. Junot Diaz. My point is not that everything is bad, but that everything is dangerous. Michel Foucault. Introduction. When I was in my late teens and early 20s, I was consumed by sex. Not by the physical urge to have it, although I had my share of crushes and unfulfilled desires. Nor was I overly concerned with the particulars of how I might go about it, although I studiously read Cosmopolitan each month so that I would know what to do when the occasion arose. My obsession was more esoteric than that. I was consumed by the idea of sex, by what it meant and by what it might reveal about who I was. If I didn't have sex, did that make me frigid or a loser? If I did do it, but with someone I didn't love, or worse, with someone who didn't love me, would I regret the decision later? What if Cosmo's 36 hot new sex positions failed me in practice? Friends had reported that some of them were tricky to pull off. I had grown up on a diet of teen magazines that treated sex with cautious reverence, followed by women's magazines that celebrated it as a symbol of female empowerment. In the sitcoms I watched on TV, the single characters dated, and by implication slept with, new people each week. In the conversations I had with acquaintances, sex was at once a subject of nervous excitement and an unspoken assumption, something it was expected that everyone was doing. I, meanwhile, had made it not only through high school a virgin, but through 4 years of college as well. This was not an outcome of my own design, and it was not something that most people would have guessed about me. From the outside, I looked like a normal girl, or at least I hoped I did. I did normal girl things like go to parties, flirt, and exchange dirty jokes with my friends. In some arenas, I even fared a little better than normal. I didn't just go to the occasional party. I was a veritable social butterfly. I didn't just try to make myself look presentable for class. I got up an extra 45 minutes early to wash, dry, and straighten my hair. But beneath the facade, I felt unattractive in the most literal sense of the word, incapable of attracting anyone I was interested in, regardless of how many friends I had or how much I manipulated my appearance to match what I thought I was supposed to look like. These two states, girl about town and secret sexual loser, seemed irreconcilable to me, each one canceling out the other. My lack of a sex life felt like a mark of failed moral character, the physical manifestation of every flaw I had ever suspected I had, and of every defect I feared that the people around me were all too aware of, but were too polite to mention out loud. Why else would I be uniquely incapable of an act that everyone else appeared to navigate with ease? In an era in which most of what we hear and read about sex tends towards the sensational, my story might seem unusual. But my concerns weren't unique to me at all. To the contrary, they were a reflection of broader social and political trends. They were a product of a culture that tells us we must be sexy, sexually active, and skilled in bed in order to be adequate human beings, and that teaches us that the truth of who we are can be found in our sex lives. Sex is an act bound up in the body, but the way that each of us experiences it is driven by more than just biology. Everything about sex, from the stories we choose to share with our friends, to the people we choose to do it with, to the remarkably standardized sexual playbook that starts with kissing, followed by touching, and finally penetration, is influenced by social and cultural forces. Sex is not just physical, but symbolic, employed as a barometer of the success of our relationships and the degree to which other people want to be intimate with us. It serves as a proxy for our physical attractiveness and how well we fit in with the people around us. What each of us believes about sex is a product of our particular time and place. The 2nd century theologian Clement of Alexandria advised Christians not only against engaging in non-reproductive sexual acts, such as oral and anal sex, but also against having sex at especially pleasurable times of day, such as the morning, the daytime, or after dinner. That is to say, at virtually any time of the day. The Victorians delighted in cataloging every variety of possible deviance, from bondage to bestiality, to having sex from behind rather than face to face. Even the ancient Greeks, regularly praised for their open-minded approach to carnal matters, operated within a complex and contradictory code of sexual ethics, in which sexual relationships between boys and men were treated as a rite of passage into adulthood, but it was considered demeaning for a man to be penetrated by a man of the same age and social status. But despite our long-standing preoccupation with sexuality, most people know surprisingly little about the sex lives of others. One result of this information gap is that, like I did, many people assume that others are having better sex, and more of it, than they actually are. While researching his book, Guyland, The Perilous World in Which Boys Become Men, sociologist Michael Kimmel asked male college students across the United States what proportion of their classmates they believed had sex on any given weekend. The average answer they gave was about 80%. In fact, according to the online college social life survey, a cross-campus study of more than 24,000 American university students, 80% is the proportion of college seniors who have ever had sex. Writes Kimmel, the actual percentage who have sex on any given weekend is closer to 5 to 10%. Kathleen Bogle, another American sociologist whose research focuses on young people and casual sex, has made similar observations. No matter how much sex the students she interviewed were having, most of them assumed that other young people were having even more. Even when I felt most isolated and insecure, I knew that many people had sexual histories that were less perfect, or at least more complex, than they let on in public. Most of the conversations I participated in about sex were at once embellished and notably lacking in detail, designed to convey an impression of experience and sophistication, while giving away as little information as possible. But the wall wasn't always up. I would drop my guard around my closest friends, and they would drop theirs around me. The issues they were dealing with were often different from my own, but they were enough to suggest that others too may have covered up any cracks in their sexual facade with a metaphorical layer of paint. It wasn't until shortly before my 25th birthday, however, that I began to realize how thinly that coat of paint might be applied. This book is dedicated to my good friend Monica, a vivacious ball of energy I met through a youth arts organization we both worked at in our early 20s, and with whom I fell in swift platonic love when I read her witty, self-reflective blogs and zines, in which she chronicled everything from the guys she was crushing on to her work as a bartender. Monica represented everything I thought a young woman should be, and everything I aspired to be myself. She was confident and friendly and adventurous, and one of the smartest, most insightful people I knew. She was fun. The kind of person who always stayed out late because you never knew how the night would end if you went out, but you always knew what would happen if you stayed home. This was a woman who, only a couple of years before, had crafted badges reading $5 kiss and worn them out to clubs. In other words, she was about as far from the stereotype of the uptight wallflower as you could get. Then one summer evening, when we were walking to our respective public transport hubs after a party, she turned to me and declared, in the same careless yet dramatic manner in which she might have told me about a new band she had discovered, "You know, next month it'll be 2 years since I've had sex, and I haven't kissed anyone in a year." I tried not to show it at the time, but I was floored. That my own sexual history fell short of the benchmarks that had been set out for me, I knew very well. But to realize that one of my most brilliant, gregarious friends might be in the same boat was a revelation. If someone as outgoing and seemingly sexually confident as Monica was not sexually active, then maybe sex wasn't so ubiquitous, or its absence such a mark of failure, after all. My curiosity piqued. I decided to find out what my peers were really experiencing, with a view to writing an article about my observations. I set up an online survey and distributed the call out to my friends and acquaintances, all strictly anonymous, of course, asking them how many people they'd had sex with and what kinds of relationships they'd had. One guy, in his late 20s, confessed that after losing his virginity a decade earlier, he didn't have sex again for 2 years. "I wasn't particularly interested in it," he wrote. "I would pick up girls in bars, but didn't want to take things any further than second or third base." He told me that he had laughed when he saw 40 Days and 40 Nights, the early aughts comedy depicting teen heartthrob Josh Hartnett's struggle to stay celibate for a month. One 30-something colleague revealed that she hadn't had sex in more than 10 years, since her last relationship had ended. The responses weren't all about not getting laid. One man, in his early 30s, divulged that he'd had over 100 sexual partners. Another friend, a gay man then in his early 20s, told me over dinner that he'd had more than 300 partners. 2 years later, when we revisited the conversation, he was up to almost 500. But they were even greater exceptions than I was. At the same time that I was starting to ask myself these questions, academics like Kimmel, Bogle, and New York University's Paula England were beginning to conduct broad-scale quantitative surveys of young adult sexual behavior. Like my own informal surveys, their results suggested that my generation's sex and social lives weren't the booze-soaked, wet t-shirt-clad perma-party they were increasingly being portrayed as in the media. Even more interesting than the survey results were the conversations my investigation sparked with the people I encountered in my day-to-day life. As soon as people knew I was writing about sex, they wanted to talk to me about it, and not just in the usual exchange of repartee or relationship troubleshooting that I was accustomed to. They wanted to talk about their insecurities and uncertainties, about those aspects of their sexual histories they had never quite been able to make sense of or were too embarrassed to tell other people about. Everyone, it seemed, had a story to tell, and most of them felt like they were falling short of the ideal in some way. The more of these conversations I had, the more I realized that we needed a new way of speaking about sex, one that not only encompassed a broader array of experiences, but that treated sex as a social act as much as a biological one. It was time to go beyond the usual conversations about the battle of the sexes, hookup culture, and the effects of internet pornography, to look more deeply at the assumptions we hold about sexuality and why we believe them to be true. In other words, it was time to formalize my investigation. So I went to the library and picked up every book I could find on the subject, along with hundreds of academic journal articles across the fields of sociology, psychology, and medical science. I wanted to educate myself on everything from campus casual sex cultures to how norms are created and upheld, to the way that our perceptions of sexual dysfunction have evolved over time. I continued to read the same magazines and watch the same TV shows that had fueled my insecurities about my own sexual history, but instead of looking to them for guidance on the ways of the world, I studied their content with a critical eye, interrogating the assumptions they made about their readers and the surprisingly subtle ways in which they communicated what kind of behavior was acceptable and expected. Along the way, I traveled across the United States, Canada, Australia, and the UK to speak with more than 200 people about their sex lives and was contacted by hundreds more. Most of them, like me, were members of the generation popularly known as millennials, those born between the early 1980s and the mid-1990s. They were men and women, gay and straight, white, black, Asian, and Latino. But for all their differences, they were united by a sense that there was something wrong with the stories we tell about sex, and most of all, with the way that our culture alternately elevates and demonizes sexuality. I began to realize that we were in the grip of a sex myth, which regulated our sexual behavior even as on the surface we appeared to be more free than we had ever been before. The first layer of the sex myth was the most obvious, the media myth of a hypersexual society, visible in everything from moral panics over wayward youth to the saturation of sexual content in popular culture, to the idea that to be sexually liberated, to be confident, free, and above all true to ourselves, meant being sexual in one very particular way. The second, less obvious dimension of the sex myth was the cultural and emotional value invested in sex, the belief that sex was more special, more significant, a source of greater thrills and more perfect pleasure than any other activity humans engage in. I didn't feel unattractive and inadequate just because I wasn't having sex. I felt that way because I lived in a culture that told me that my sex life was one of the most defining qualities of who I was. It wasn't sex that was the problem, but the importance that I, and so many others, had attached to it. In this book, I will make visible some of the building blocks upon which our assumptions about sex are grounded, our beliefs about what is normal and desirable, how it is appropriate for a man or a woman to behave, and what makes a person good in bed. I will chart how we have moved from a culture that once told us we were dirty if we did have sex, to one that tells us we are defective if we do not get it enough, and how these seemingly conflicting ideas have more in common than we tend to think. Most crucially, I will show how the sex myth has made sex the bedrock of our morals and identity, and how this link between sex and self is used to shape our behavior and even our desires. Finally, I will consider what life might look like beyond the sex myth. What would it take to live in a society that respects differences in all its forms? How can we create a culture that privileges more than just a facade of sexual freedom? Is it possible to drain sex of its grand significance? And is that something we should even aspire to do? This book probably won't demolish our existing beliefs about sex completely, and it probably won't usher us into a new sexual utopia. But I believe that the first step to solving a problem is to name it, and I hope that in naming the sex myth, we can begin to move toward a way of thinking about sex that is less fraught, more honest, and ultimately more free for everyone. 1. This is not what liberation looks like. The first episode of the British teen drama Skins began with a cacophony of phone calls. Tony Stoneham, the show's charismatic alpha male lead, was on a mission to help his best friend, the hapless but lovable nerd Sid, lose his virginity before his 17th birthday. And the key to achieving this goal? We go to a party and get some girl raucously spliffed, joked Tony. In her confused state, she comes to believe momentarily, of course, that you're attractive, and then she bangs your brains out. As plot lines go, virginity loss quests like this one are a standard coming-of-age trope. Think of the pact between four friends to get laid before senior prom in American Pie, or Blair Waldorf's increasingly frenzied attempts to seduce her reluctant high school sweetheart Nate in the first season of Gossip Girl. But when Skins launched in the United States at the beginning of 2011, the notoriously conservative Parents Television Council declared it the most dangerous show for children we have ever seen. The reaction may have been over the top, but it wasn't surprising. Skins, after all, was a show about young people writ wild that, in the words of PTC President Tim Winter, made light of lying to parents and showed all manner of harmful, irresponsible, illegal, and adult-themed behavior, much of it sexual. And there is little that simultaneously terrifies and titillates more than the spectacle of youth out of control. Skins, to its credit, took the allure of the out-of-control teenager to a less glamorous place than many of its counterparts. Where the high school juniors on Gossip Girl had earth-shattering orgasms in the backseats of limousines, their counterparts in Skins got it on in bathroom stalls, their adolescent butt cheeks awkwardly on display. Where the teenage cast of the CW's 90210 sipped on cocktails in upscale Mexican resorts without so much as a request for an ID, their equivalents on Skins got wasted at seedy outdoor raves. But just because Skins employed a grittier brand of hedonism than other teenage dramas doesn't mean that it revealed an unspoken truth of young adult life. To the contrary, shows like Skins tell us exactly what we want to hear. That young people today are more shameless, wanton, and darkly glamorous than any generation before them. They don't challenge our preconceptions of sex so much as they affirm them, while wrapping up our voyeurism with a bow of rebellion. In other words, shows like Skins feed directly into the first layer of the sex myth, that our culture has never been more sexually debauched, and that this debauchery is alternately the source of our downfall and our freedom. Millennials gone wild. Older people have wrung their hands over young people's bad behavior since Plato complained about youth disrespecting their parents and rioting in the streets in the 4th century BC. And as signs of aging go, That first moment of horror at what the next generation might be doing with their genitals ranks up there with sprouting your first gray hair or hanging up your dancing shoes in favor of a night in with Netflix. But at some point in the mid-aughts, anxieties about teens, 20-somethings, and sex began to hit a fever pitch. Part of it was a product of popular culture. The first half of the aughts saw the rise of Girls Gone Wild, which enticed young women to take off their tops and perform on camera in exchange for GGW-branded hats and T-shirts. It saw Britney Spears and Christina Aguilera, and later Hilary Duff, Selena Gomez, and Miley Cyrus, go from artificially chaste Disney stars to artificially sexy pop starlets in the blink of a music video. Paris Hilton and Kim Kardashian parlayed homemade sex tapes into international media empires encompassing jewelry, nightclubs, music, multiple reality TV shows, and more. Playboy went from a softcore porn magazine to an aspirational pop culture brand, and Victoria's Secret went from a staid underwear retailer to a family-friendly peep show starring some of the world's most beautiful women. Where the 1980s had been dominated by anti-porn crusaders such as radical feminist Andrea Dworkin and legal scholar Catherine McKinnon, by the beginning of the 21st century, the cultural pendulum had swung in a more libertarian direction. The sex wars, which had pitted feminists against one another on the integrity of everything from sex work to BDSM to having sex with men, had been won. And the winning position was that sexual imagery didn't have to be degrading or objectifying. To the contrary, eroticism could be a source of power. And increasingly, for younger women especially, sexuality had become a key arena in which power was exercised, whether it was in books such as The Ethical Slut or The Happy Hookup, which promoted the invigorating possibilities of casual sex, or dynamic, successful women such as singer Beyoncé, Olympic swimmer Amanda Beard, and would-be lawyers taking off their clothes for softcore men's magazines like Maxim or FHM. Enter Ariel Levy, whose 2005 book, Female Chauvinist Pigs, flipped the prevailing story about sex and popular culture on its head. Levy's concern wasn't about the proliferation of sex, but its representation, and the way that sex and female empowerment had become entwined in a manner that was both ubiquitous and compulsory. What we once regarded as a kind of sexual expression, we now view as sexuality, she wrote. But the success of Female Chauvinist Pigs also provided a platform for a number of unarticulated anxieties that had been brewing just beneath the surface of public debate, and the news media and commentariat enthusiastically latched on to the idea that young people today, and young women in particular, were more sexually precocious than any generation that had come before them. On NPR, sex educator Deborah Rothman worried that casual sex was robbing 20-somethings of their capacity to form intimate relationships, while Christian sociologist Mark Regnerus argued in Slate that hooking up tipped the scales of sexual power too far in men's favor, labeling it a manner of sexual economics. In Britain's Daily Mail, filmmaker Olivia Lichtenstein reported breathlessly on the deeply disturbing Generation SEX. In my home country of Australia, the newspapers told stories of 10-year-olds smeared with too much lipstick and 20-somethings dropping their pants to shake their buttocks like G-string baboons in estrus. As one article said, salivating, "They're here, they're mostly bare, and they don't care who's looking." This wasn't the first time there had been widespread alarm about the sexual habits of the young and single. In his 1920 novel, This Side of Paradise, F. Scott Fitzgerald told tales of Victorian mothers startled by how casually their daughters were accustomed to being kissed. When the oral contraceptive pill made its debut in the early 1960s, U.S. News and World Report worried that it would lead to sexual anarchy. A 1964 cover story for Time despaired the dawn of champagne parties for teenagers, padded brasiers for 12-year-olds, and going steady at ever younger ages. The magazine recalled the Orgon box, a closet-shaped device popularized by Austrian psychoanalyst and sex liberationist Wilhelm Reich in the 1940s, which claimed to unleash the sexual energy of the person inside it. Now, the anonymous editorial lamented, it sometimes seems that all America is one big Orgon box. But although teenagers and 20-somethings were the subject of much of this moralizing, the real anxiety wasn't about young people. Not really. They were just a lightning rod for a broader set of concerns about a sexual culture that was changing then and is still doing so now, in ways both real and imagined. And a lot has changed. Over the past half-century, the way we form our families has diversified from the cookie-cutter nuclear model that wallpapered popular culture in the 1950s and 1960s to encompass same-sex couples, single parents, blended families, and more. We are marrying later and in smaller numbers. In 2013, 28% of American adults had never been married, up from just 15% in 1960. In the space of 50 years, sex has gone from being permitted only within marriage, to being accepted within a monogamous relationship, to being embraced, in some circles at least, outside the framework of any ongoing relationship at all. And with the rise of new online and mobile dating technologies such as Tinder and OkCupid, if you're looking for no-strings-attached sex, it is easier to find now than ever before. More than an anxiety about young people in particular, the hysteria over teen and 20-something sex that emerged in the aughts was rooted in a fear that, in an attempt to create a sexually liberated society, we had accidentally unleashed more freedom than we could handle. As Australian newspaper The Age warned in 2009, many teenagers and young adults have turned the free sex mantra of the 1970s into a lifestyle, and older generations simply don't have a clue. When I first began to notice these articles in my early 20s, I was skeptical of how accurate they were. For my own 22nd birthday party, I had asked my friends to dress up as hotel heiresses Paris and Nikki Hilton, famous for their fortune and their skimpy clothes, for a night at a downtown Sydney club. It seemed fun, theatrical, and mildly humorous, an act of performance and satire. We applied the same tongue-in-cheek humor a few months later when the Tina Fey-penned Mean Girls was released in cinemas, heading out to a college party in sky-high heels and thigh-skimming skirts. To a casual observer on the street, we probably looked like the very image of raunch culture, but in our minds, we were making fun of the stereotype. The hyper-sexualized Girls Gone Wild story that was dominating the media didn't fit with anything I'd seen or experienced. I had spent most of the first half of my 20s convinced that everyone was getting laid more than I was, but not once had I imagined it manifesting as a row of naked buttocks convulsing like baboons in estrus. It was less in your face than that. It was in the sigh one friend let out a few days after breaking up with her long-term boyfriend. "How do you do it?" she asked me, driving her fork into the college cafeteria table in an effort to diffuse her sexual frustration. It was in the grin on another friend's face as he pointed to the car seat on which he'd had his first one-night stand. Most of what we knew about each other's sex lives was communicated through inference. You told people about the 3 weekends during which you did hook up, not the 49 during which you didn't. Like most college students, most of my friends had had sex at some point, whether it was with a high school sweetheart, a one-night stand, or a first love they had met on campus. Some of them had had casual sex, or had hooked up in relationships that petered out before either party had a chance to define them. But the sex my friends were having didn't look like the scandalous descriptions in the newspapers or the aspirational hedonism in the magazines we read. It wasn't just our experiences that diverged from the media stereotypes. The online college social life survey found that 72% of college students engage in some kind of hookup at least once by their senior year. But it also found that most of them don't do it all that often, with 40% of those surveyed hooking up with 3 or fewer people over the course of their college career. Nor did hooking up necessarily translate to the type of sexual activity that most people who write about its dangers might imagine. Only 1/3 of students had engaged in intercourse during their most recent hookup. Even more telling, 1 in 5 students hadn't hooked up at all. These statistics were echoed in stories I heard from young people across the English-speaking world. "A lot of people say that college is so full of sex," reported Shannon, a pretty freshman with long limbs and strawberry blonde hair. "And it is a pretty party-hard environment in terms of drinking. It can be full-on, but sex? Not so much." A 19-year-old communications student at an East Coast liberal arts university, Shannon is smart, articulate, and sexually confident. She first had sex 3 years ago with her high school boyfriend.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?